The cat who helped write a scientific paper. In 1975, a physics professor named Jack H. Hetherington wrote a research paper about atomic behavior. He was planning to submit this paper to a well-known scientific journal called the Physical Review Letters. However, when he was proofreading his work, he realized that he had unintentionally used the word we when writing about himself. Although this was a small mistake, it was very problematic. The Physical Review Letters had a rule against the use of the word we unless the paper had multiple authors. Hetherington had written his entire paper on a typewriter, and he didn't want to retype it all just to fix his error. Instead, he simply decided to credit another author. The author he chose was his cat, Chester. He changed Chester's name to Felis domesticus Chester Willard, shortened to FDC Willard, to make it more believable. Hetherington's plan worked, and his paper was published. Eventually, he admitted that the co-author was a cat, and even had Chester sign copies of the paper by making ink paw prints. Rabbit Island in Japan. Okinoshima, a small island off the coast of Japan, is a place mostly populated by rabbits. The island is a popular tourist destination for people who want to spend the day with cute animals. Tourists can reach this island by taking a ferry over from the mainland. Although Okinoshima is mostly known for the rabbits that live there today, it is also a very historical site. The island was once used to produce chemical weapons during World War II. Back then, these weapon factories were kept so secret that Okinoshima wasn't even labeled on Japanese maps. Many people believe that the island's rabbit population is related to this history. A common theory is that the military once brought rabbits to the island to test chemicals on, and a few rabbits were released into the wild. Today, over 1,000 rabbits live there, and the population is only growing. Cloning. Cloning is the process of creating a genetically identical copy of an organism. Researchers have been experimenting with cloning since the 1900s, when they attempted to create genetic copies of animal embryos. As technology became more advanced, it became possible to make clones of fully grown creatures. The first successful cloning of an adult organism was in 1996, when a British research group managed to produce a cloned sheep. The sheep's name was Dolly, and she lived for 6 years. Scientists have since managed to clone many other types of animals. In fact, there are now companies that offer expensive pet cloning services. The idea of human cloning has come up in scientific discussions, but many people have ethical concerns about the consequences. Because of this, human cloning is illegal in several countries. The Chernobyl disaster. On April 26, 1986, the nuclear reactor of the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine exploded. The explosion occurred early in the morning while plant workers were performing a maintenance check. They had turned off a control system that was keeping the reactor stable. The initial explosion killed 2 of the workers, and 28 other workers died of radiation sickness in the months after the disaster. The explosion also caused residents of a nearby town called Pripyat to be exposed to radiation. Because of this, the residents were forced to evacuate and find new places to live. In order to prevent more deaths from radiation exposure, the government of what was then the Soviet Union created an exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant. Although the zone is now safe for tourists to visit, scientists believe that the most contaminated areas will not be habitable for over 20,000 years. The French Revolution. The French Revolution was a violent political movement that took place in the late 18th century. The unrest in France began during the reign of King Louis XVI, whose spending decisions had led the country into debt. In order to solve this problem, Louis XVI called on an assembly of French citizens to vote on what to do. However, poor citizens found that higher-class citizens had the power to outvote them. This led to the decision to place higher taxes on commoners. Angered by this decision, the commoners created their own assembly and began to revolt. After invading Louis XVI's palace, the revolutionaries gained control of France. The new government abolished the monarchy and executed both the king and his wife, Marie Antoinette. But while the king was no longer in charge of France, the French Revolution would continue for years after his execution, as the new government waged war against other European countries that were afraid their citizens would follow France's example. How stars die. All stars die eventually, but different stars can die in very different ways. Our sun is a medium-sized star. That means that when the sun dies, it will simply turn into something called a white dwarf. White dwarfs are small, dense celestial objects that contain the matter left over from dead stars. However, some stars are much more massive than our sun, and their deaths are much more violent. When a massive star gets older, it starts to cool down. This is because the star is using up the last of its fuel. Once the star has no fuel left, it will implode. This implosion is called a supernova. The event is so bright that if a star in our galaxy caused a supernova, we could possibly see it from Earth. The force of a supernova causes the star's mass to be compressed into a very small space with an incredibly strong gravitational pull. This is called a black hole, and it is so powerful that nothing can escape from it. The history of Santa Claus. Children all around the world today know about Santa Claus, the man who delivers gifts to every house on Christmas Eve. The story of Santa has been around for a long time. The legend was based on a bishop named Saint Nicholas, who was born in Turkey almost 2,000 years ago. Saint Nicholas was a wealthy man who wanted to share his fortune with people who were poor or hungry. Celebrating Saint Nicholas was originally a Dutch tradition. Dutch people living in New York City in the 18th century made the legend popular in American culture, and the image of Santa became an important symbol of Christmas. Although Santa Claus is his most common name in the United States and Canada, Santa has many different names in different parts of the world, such as Father Christmas, Saint Nick, and Kris Kringle. The Great Depression. The Great Depression was a worldwide economic recession. It began in 1929 in the United States, when the value of stocks decreased drastically. People who had invested their savings lost a lot of money, and an overall decrease in spending caused many Americans to lose their jobs. This downturn quickly began to affect the rest of the world because the United States couldn't afford to trade with other countries frequently. This was a particularly difficult time for American farmers, who were also dealing with harsh climate conditions like droughts and dust storms. Many unemployed farmers from the prairie states began to migrate west in hopes of finding work. Throughout the recession, The American government worked to build welfare programs to help support unemployed people. These programs contributed to the end of the Great Depression in 1939, around the start of World War II.